Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Abigail Spann. I am a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Epsilon Omega Chapter. Thank you for joining our event this evening. Them now, you tomorrow. Our webmaster for this evening is our Shayla Matuka and Katina Wilcher, both members of Epsilon Omega Chapter. And I will be your moderator for this evening. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our supporters, the League of Women Voters of Champaign County, Bend the Arc Jewish Action of Champaign-Urbana, the organizations collectively known as the Divine Nine, the NAACP, the Champaign-Urbana Chapter, the NA National African American National Association for Negro Women, the ACLU of Champaign County, and Champaign-Urbana Solidarity Sundays. Just to go over a few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you have questions for tonight's speaker, please put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. This will, unfortunately, we are in webinar mode, so there will not be an opportunity for you to raise your hand or unmute yourself. And so any comments or questions that you have, please put those in Q&A. We will be doing a few polls tonight. Please feel free to participate in those polls. If you are on our Facebook page, unfortunately, you will not be able to participate in the polls, but we will make sure that we read the polls out so that you know which polls we're doing, and then that we will read out the results as well, so that you know the outcome of those polls. But thank you for those of you who are joining us through Zoom, and thank you for those of you who are joining us on Facebook. So let me give you just a little bit of an agenda for this evening. We will first have one poll that, again, you'll have an opportunity to participate. Then we'll have Langston Spann read the fable of the story of the mouse. Then we'll have our second poll. Following that, we'll have our keynote speaker, questions and answers if you have those. And then we'll have our final poll and closing remarks. So again, thank you for joining us. And with that, we'll go ahead and put up our first poll. So the first poll is, on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being not concerned at all, and 5 being extremely concerned, where does voter suppression fall on that continuum for you? 1, not concerned at all. 2, somewhat concerned. 3, concerned. 4, very concerned. And 5, extremely concerned. For those of you who are joining us on the webinar, please go ahead and submit your response. Okay, so of the attendees responding, 100% said extremely concerned, that voter suppression, they're very concerned about voter suppression efforts. Thank you for those of you participating in that poll. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Langston Spann to read the story of the mouse. Langston Spann is a junior at Central High School. And Langston, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to pull the story up right here. So I got it. All right. This is a story of the mouse. A mouse looked through the crack in the wall to see the farmer and his wife open a package. What food might this contain, the mouse wondered. He was devastated to discover that it was a mouse trap. Retreating to the farmyard, the mouse proclaimed the warning. There's a mouse trap in the house. There's a mouse trap in the house. The chicken clucked and scratched and raised her head and said, Mr. Mouse, I can tell this is a concern for you, but it is of no consequences to me. I am not bothered by it. The mouse turned to the pig and told him, there's a mouse trap in the house. There's a mouse trap in the house. The pig sympathized, but said, I am sorry, Mr. Mouse, but there is nothing I can do about it, but pray. The mouse turned to the cow and said, there's a mouse trap in the house. There's a mouse trap in the house. The cow said, wow, Mr. Mouse, I'm sorry for you, but it's no skin off my nose. So the mouse returned to the house, head down and dejected to face the farmer's mousetrap alone. That very night, a sound was heard throughout the house, like the sound of a mousetrap catching its prey. The farmer's wife quickly rushed to see what was caught. In the darkness, she did not see it was a venomous snake who had fallen into the trap and got caught. The snake bit the farmer's wife. The farmer rushed her into the hospital and returned home with a fever. Everyone knows you treat a fever with fresh chicken soup, so the farmer took his hatchet to the farmyard for the soup's main ingredient. But the wife's sickness continued, so friends and neighbors came to sit with her all around the clock. To feed him, the farmer butchered the pig. The farmer's wife did not get well. She died. Because so many people came for her funeral, the farmer had the cow slaughtered to provide meat for all of them. The mouse looked upon it all from his crack in the wall with great sadness. So the next time you hear someone facing a problem and think it doesn't concern you, remember, when one of us is threatened, we are all at risk. We are all involved in this journey called life. And remember, each of us is a vital thread in each other's tapestry, our lives woven together for a reason. As we work to accomplish the goals of our community, let us accept the challenge to care and look out for our fellow man and woman and for each other.
Thank you, Langston, for reading that very timely fable. So as you know, our forefathers for many generations, as Dr. Spann will talk about this evening, fought for our right to vote. And part of our efforts this evening in doing this program, as part of our ongoing voter education and registration series, is to continue to encourage everyone to vote, to encourage members of our community to vote in the local elections, state elections, as well as national elections. The reality is that when we don't use our voice to vote, the impact can be tremendous. So just like the mouse, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're not only voting for the interests of us, but we're voting for the interests of our community. So hopefully today's session will encourage you to continue to use your voice, both in local elections, again, state elections, as well as national elections, because the impact is significant as we're seeing around the country. So we'll have our second poll, which is a three-part poll. And so can we have the first question? So the first question is, do you vote regularly in municipal elections? Yes or no? Okay, so we have 92% of respondents indicating that yes, they do vote regularly in municipal elections, and 8% indicating that they do not vote regularly. The second part of that question, please. The second part is, do you vote regularly in state elections, yes or no? And 100% of respondents indicated that they do vote regularly in state elections. Thank you. And the final part of this question, do you vote regularly in national elections, yes or no? And again, 100% of attendees indicated that they do vote regularly in national elections. Thank you all for responding to those poll questions. So I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Christopher Spann. Dr. Spann is the new Chief of Staff and Associate Chancellor for Administration and Pre-K through 12 initiatives at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. For the past decade, he served as an Associate Dean in the College of Education. He is the author of From Cotton Field to Schoolhouse, African American Education in Mississippi, 1862 to 1875. And he has published numerous articles and book chapters on the educational history of African Americans. This evening, Dr. Spann will talk about voter suppression, laws, policies, and practices. He will talk about the importance of one's vote, and he will conclude his remarks by sharing information that is appropriate for you as a voter. And so I will turn it over to Christopher Spann.
All right. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for attending this presentation, and in particular, thank Alpha Kappa Alpha, the chapter of Epsilon, Epsilon Omega, for providing me an opportunity to speak this evening with the group. As I'm going through this introduction to get my PowerPoint started here to have a conversation with you, slide deck, I want to kind of reiterate what Camille Abdullah Spann just said about Langston Spann. Not only is the story impactful, but his ability to read it with both emotion and understanding really kind of set the tone, not just for this conversation, but hopefully for Lily, the way that we envision our community, because it was the mouse in that moment today, but it ended up being all the other farm animals tomorrow, based on the circumstances, and it's something that you can't necessarily predict. And so what I'd like to do as a historian here is kind of walk you through the long history of voter access and suppression, and the importance and the power that you have with regards to your vote. I always am a little challenged by Zoom, so you have to forgive me as I'm trying to click buttons so I can see the entirety of my presentation as we go forward. And I do want to make sure, everyone can hear me and see the presentation. So if I can get members of the audience to send in a yes in the chat, that would be absolutely fantastic. And then I know I can go ahead and proceed as we go forward. All right. Thank you, Ruth. So the title of my talk is Them Today, You Tomorrow, the Long History of Voter Suppression and the Importance of Knowing the Power of Your Vote. And again, I don't want you to think I'm an expert on voter suppression or an expert on the history of voting. I want you to see this as almost an opportunity to understand the long history of the challenges that people have faced, and that voter suppression and the struggle to obtain the vote is not something new. And I want us to have both that introduction as well as a conversation from there. So when we think about the overall purpose of this presentation, again, it offers an overview of the long history of voter suppression in this nation and highlights the history of voter access and voter suppression laws in the United States. how voter suppression shaped this nation. The third purpose is to illustrate the long struggle to make voting a protected constitutional right. I think if I had a series of samples or polls for you, I would have had a number of questions as to, is voting a protected constitutional right? When did it become a constitutional right for everyone? Was it universal when it first happened? I want to provide at the same time, in the purpose of this conversation, contemporary examples of voter suppression. And then last but not least, I want to reemphasize what's already been stated multiple times here, is the importance of voting, despite the challenges that people may face. So let's start at the beginning. Anybody who knows me knows I always start at the beginning. And when you think about the beginning of our nation, the early republic, I don't think, rarely do we think about the long arc of voting rights in the United States. But upon the ratification of the Constitution in 1787, states such as Connecticut or Massachusetts, New Jersey, limited the power to vote to property owning or tax-paying free white males. And essentially, that constituted about 6% of the total population. And if we think about that in that sense, what that means is that virtually everyone else who was excluded from voting in the earliest years of the Republic were women, almost 100%. There were always exceptions to that rule. They were enslaved people and free African Americans. They were Native Americans. People were denied at least 4 of the colonies, denied Jews the right to vote at the founding of this nation. 5 colonies that would become states denied Catholics the right to vote. And virtually all landless white men were denied the right to vote. But within just a handful of years, going again from 1787 to 1790, there would be this new naturalization law that would allow virtually all quote unquote free white males, which I want to have a conversation about in a second, to become citizens and by default have that right to vote. And literally for 80 years, this law determined citizenship, voting until the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1868 and the 15th Amendment in 1870. But one thing I want to really point your eyes to as we look at, here's the actual language from the 1790 Naturalization Act, and it's highlighted here, is this language of free white person. Most times when we think about what it means to be white in the United States, we don't think about how whiteness in itself had variation. And so you think of a person who's enslaved, you immediately think Black. If you think of a person who would be free, you would think of a person who's white. But there's no need to put the word free in front of white unless all whites weren't free in this sense. And so you think about where indentured servitude was still playing a role in society in that regard. They also use the language there. It says that any alien, being a free white person, alien meaning someone who was foreign born. So they're qualifying the fact that you could be foreign born as well, but you're still a free white person, because many people who had immigrated to the United States came in the form of indentured servitude. And then it doesn't even get into the way that white in itself as a race, has variation and multiplicity in the way we think about it. So I want to point you to that, because this language is important. When you think about only 6% could vote 3 years earlier, you just radically changed that number to upwards to 50% of white America could vote. It wasn't quite 50% within just a handful of years. And again, excluding the idea that women would have access to the vote in this regard, because when they say free white persons, it's very gender specific here. And so when we think about that dynamic of voting in the United States, we're starting our history with a very select number of people who can vote, not necessarily some universal principle that voting is a constitutionally protected right for every person or inhabitant in the United States. And there were direct challenges and protests to the language within the Constitution, the language leading up to the Constitution, and then the language defined by these acts that happened after the Constitution, like the 1790 Act in this sense. So one of the first forms of challenge and protest came from Abigail Adams, wife of the second president of the United States, John Adams, and mother of the sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. And she was an outspoken advocate for women voting and urged her husband in a number of different letters, but this one in particular, a letter that she wrote following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where she said, you need to remember the ladies, because no colony can exist by just one side always having the right to rule, to vote, and to determine. That you have to have a universal perspective going forward to have truly the democratic society that's being espoused in the day. And if you go to 1848, literally like a half decade plus later in Seneca Falls, New York, the leading women of the day launched the women's suffrage movement, arguing for women to have the constitutional right to vote. And there were always, in every year, there were always individuals who spoke about women having the right to vote. But here they decided to launch a convention. Some of you may have heard of Sojourner Truth, for example, who would show up to Seneca Falls, famed abolitionist, suffragist. She was emancipated from slavery in New York and would literally go get her children who were sold into slavery in the Deep South. When the northern colonies had slavery, they did what is called a gradual emancipation or a gradual abolition of slavery in these northern colonies like New York that would become a state, or New Jersey. And it was here that anyone who was under the age of 21 for male and 18 for female could be sold into bondage, kept in bondage and sold into bondage to the lower South, where slavery was well intact. And so when they sold her children in Alabama, she literally walked to Alabama to get her kids and then walked back to New York and declared all their freedom. And so she's a remarkable personality. Her name was Isabella Baumfree, where she would become Sojourner Truth. But she would show up, and the famous "Aren't I a Woman" speech would be here at Seneca Falls as women were debating suffrage. The real argument were white women having the opportunity to vote. And she was basically saying, well, what about me, as a Black woman? And so the idea that somehow gender was being denied a vote, but so was race being denied a vote. And in the case of Sojourner Truth, it was gender and race. And so you see this push, but this direct challenge and protest to it. And for nearly 7 decades, as this is a photograph of one of them, freeborn African Americans held conventions advocating for not only the abolition of slavery, but for African Americans to have the right to vote. And then more than 200 of these conventions were held between the 1830s and the 1890s. And so you would see African Americans leading the cause, essentially Black Lives Matter movements that are happening in the 19th century to ensure that the greatest challenges impacting the African American community were being articulated and addressed. But the ultimate way to address it was to be able to have to vote in people who would change the policies and the laws of the land, including slavery itself. But 1848 was also an interesting year in the sense of the way people would gain access to the vote. And in this case, it became almost an inadvertent consideration. There was a war that ended in 1848, the Mexican-American War. This was a war over first the border of Texas. Texas had already been annexed in the United States from Mexico. They were debating what the border would be between Mexico and Texas, now the United States. It led to war. And at the end of this war of 1848, there was a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And what it meant was in all the lands that were annexed or the cessions from the war in 1848 that would go from Mexico to the United States. And here's the photograph of it. It included all of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and significant parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. And all this new land that would be annexed in the United States The question is, what do you do with the inhabitants that are already there? Are they Mexican citizens? Are they US citizens? And in Article 9 of this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it says that those who accept the treaty had the full rights of US citizenship, including, quote, free enjoyment of their liberties and property and secured of their religion with restrictions. And it's literally the language that's pulled from the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what this treaty did was two things. First, it gave newly created people, this term that pops into our lexicon here, Mexican Americans, the right to vote. The second thing that it inadvertently did is it classified anybody of Mexican origin as white in the United States, because according to the Naturalization Act of 1790, only free whites had the right to vote according to that act, that law. And so it created two things simultaneously that actually ended up being a very difficult way to navigate this loose construction, or this, the illogic of the social construction of race in the United States. There would be a number of cases that this would come up in California, for example, around school desegregation. So the Roberto Alvarez case, which would take place in the 1930s, where Roberto Alvarez was forced to go to an English, a Spanish-speaking school because he didn't speak English. But the assumption was he didn't speak English. He did speak English. And so language became the proxy for race in California. And so when Roberto Alvarez's parents sued, so he could go to the school of his choice in his neighborhood in San Diego, Lemon Grove area of San Diego, the court ruled in the Alvarez favor and said, you cannot segregate this child into a school because this child is deemed to be white in the United States. And so there's where this Article 9 comes into play. The second is the Mendez case in California. Roberto and Felicita Mendez would sue for their children to also go to a school of their choice, and not one designated where Spanish is the first language in the school. Their children, again, Spanish was their first language, but they have very strong English as a second language skills. They didn't want their children to be segregated into a school, so they sued. And this was the second time that the California Supreme Court, in this case, it was Earl Warren who would preside over the court, would say, no, you cannot discriminate against this group because they're legally defined as white in America. And both the Alvarez and the Mendez case become case precedent for Brown v. Board of Education. And when Warren takes over the court, in the Supreme Court and rules over the Brown v. Board of Education decision, he consults and refers back to these two cases as to where race played a role in public school assignment. So when you think about, we're talking about voting rights here, but you're also talking about civil rights and how the two are going back and forth. And so this is a part of our history that we don't really learn, but you can see how it traces all the way back to 1790, but also steps all the way forward to something like the Brown decision. But the 14th and the 15th Amendments are the two that really radically changed the United States and enacted in 1868 and 1870, respectively. And it changed the very meaning of citizenship and voting in the United States. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law and due process. And it determined that individuals, regardless of their previous condition of servitude or race, were citizens of the United States if naturalized or born here. And then the 15th Amendment guaranteed African-American males the right to vote. And so you can see African-American males voting here in mass number for the first time in the United States, regardless of who they are, right? So in one depiction, you can see almost a carpenter in the sense that he's got these tools in his pocket, but he's an everyday person, but you can tell by his clothes. And then behind him is an African-American who's probably a little bit better, well-to-do, economically. Behind him is a soldier, and you can see from the dress. But regardless of your background, whether you were formerly enslaved or freeborn or fought in a war, what this image is showing, you have the right to vote. And if you look, you can see there's a person who's white who's accepting the votes, that this is not somehow illegal. And even in the background between the soldier and what is presumed to be this more well-to-do African-American, there's an image that gives you the sense there's a white person waiting in line to cast their vote behind people who have historically been denied the right to vote. So this image is trying to capture the very meaning of citizenship and voting in the United States. The amazing thing is that overnight, African Americans in southern states literally went from a slave majority to a voting majority. And it was now they could determine their own politicians and laws that would govern their existence in future. This was truly Reconstruction in the United States, but it didn't come just with a wholesale acceptance. Southern whites in mass number violently opposed the citizenship and voting rights of African Americans. And they did so until all these rights were abruptly upended in the 1876 presidential election. So when you think about the idea of voter suppression, like up to this point, I've been talking about, limited access to voting. Women didn't have the right to vote. African Americans didn't have a right to vote. Native Americans didn't have a right to vote. But now that they have the right to vote, you see these tactics to suppress this vote. And in this case, violence was one form of those tactics. But it wasn't the only one. There were laws like black codes that were actually created to restrict the newfound freedoms of African Americans. There were terrorist militia groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan. There were poll taxes, meaning that you actually had to pay a tax just to cast your vote. There were literacy tests, meaning that if you didn't pass this literacy test, there was no way for you to actually cast a vote. There were grandfather clauses, meaning that if your grandfather voted in the 1860 election, then you're allowed to vote in the 1864 or 1868 election. And clearly, most African Americans, if not all African Americans in the South, were enslaved. There were less than 250,000 free blacks in the South, and there were nearly 4 million nearly 4 million African Americans who were enslaved in the South. So none of their grandfathers would have voted in the 1860 election. So they're systematically removed from the voting polls in that sense. And of course, last but not least, the fear and intimidation. And you can see here kind of this notion of these two whites, they're intimidating this African American, saying, of course, if he's going to vote our ticket, right? And so you can cast your vote, but you can't cast it the way that you want. And so here it's the Democratic ticket was the vote in favor of the preservation of something that resembles slavery and its continuation, because the dominant political party to promote slavery or have a pro-slavery cause was the Democratic ticket in this time period. And so, but you can also see in the background here that there's an African American. If you look through kind of the corridor where the person is walking out, he's kind of being polled, clearly led to the voting poll by two people on horses. So he too can cast their vote. And if you look at the dress and the clothes of the person who's leaving, his top hat is different than the top hat of the people who are holding the guns, but yet he's looking on with a degree of acceptance to say, I'm not going to stop this. This is kind of benefits me in this sense. So just as much as we were talking about voting rights and civil rights, you could begin to understand how race is playing within this entire context as we go forward. It's not just the notion of one person was free and one person was enslaved, or this very much is a very racialized consideration in this regard. But many of you probably have never even seen some of these tactics. And so what I wanted to do was at least find one of those literacy tests that was used in the United States. And I found one that was the more recent one on the books. And so this comes from the state of Louisiana. And this is 1964. And anyone who wanted to pass this test, or anyone who wanted to vote, had to pass this test. And it says here, literacy test. This test is to be given to anyone who cannot prove a 5th grade education. So now you have to have, do you understand? That's voter ID almost. You have to show proof that you've gotten to 5th grade. And I don't know about you, but I've never had a 5th grade school card in this sense. So there's some identification that's required first just to take the test. So you got to show some proof. And then it says, do what you are told to do in each statement. Nothing more, nothing less. Be careful, as one wrong answer denotes failure of the test, and you have 10 minutes to complete this test. So just one wrong answer and you can't vote in this sense. And so it says here, the very first question, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. Now, how do you answer that? Like, is there more than one way to answer that? Question 2, draw a line under the last word in this line. And that seems simple enough. You draw it under the word line, right? But it is a confusing question. Number 3, cross out the longest word in this line. Here's number 6, for example. In this space below, draw 3 circles, one inside, engulfed by the other. Here's number 8. Draw a line through the letter below that comes earliest in the alphabet. Now, you have to answer all of this. If you get one wrong, then it's over. Look at number 11. Cross out the number necessary when making the number below 1 million. None of this. I don't know if any of us could pass this test, myself included, with getting them 10 for 10, right? Or 13 for 13 in this sense. But nonetheless, one wrong answer. And here's the bad part. You don't know if you got the answer wrong because it's left to the discretion of the person administering the test. So all of this is designed as a form to suppress the vote in the region, and it was highly effective. From 1880 to 1964, African Americans did not vote en masse until after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So literally 100 years after emancipation, in that short window of time where the Reconstruction Acts actually took place, where you had the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, and African Americans were exercising their right to live as free citizens with due process and equal protection under the law. Literally for the next 80 years, what you see is this massive restriction where African Americans aren't voting at all. And so this kind of push, is the way that you see people effectively disfranchised in the United States. And it would take the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and a decade-long series of protests that today we call the Civil Rights Movement to upend kind of this legacy. So if you think about from 1880 to 1964, this is roughly the same length of time that Jim Crow, segregation by law, existed in the United States. The very people that that were deeply impacted by Jim Crow are the people required to take this test. And if they can't pass this test, they can't vote. So the moral of this story is that people unable to vote are literally people unable to change the conditions of their lives and future without some massive protest that has to take place. And so that's the impact of the legacy of the first round of voter suppression used in the United States in mass number. But even within that time period, there were citizenship and voting rights advancements, and I put question marks behind that. For example, white women were effectively afforded the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. In 1924, Native Americans were granted citizenship in the United States, which is kind of ironic because they're the indigenous people of this country, or at least land. But they could not vote in every state until 1962. Asian Americans were able to vote without major restrictions when the Immigration and Nationality Acts of 1965 were reissued, or was reissued, I apologize. And in fact, the vast majority of people of color in the United States could not vote without restriction until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So even though it was African Americans that was feeling the brunt of this voter suppression, there were many people who were just simply discouraged from trying to go out to vote because they were deemed to be too different or too foreign to actually be able to participate in the voting process. And so here is Kamoko Kimura, a prominent Japanese suffrage just who in 1917, she's waving both the flag of Japan and the United States, but advocating for the right to vote. So when we think about who is advocating for women to have the right to vote and where the 19th Amendment came about, it wasn't just, for example, white women who were the ones doing it. It was all women who were doing it. But nonetheless, they were the beneficiaries of an outcome that didn't necessarily seem to prove as universal for other women of other racial or ethnic groups. You have someone like Fannie Lou Hamer in the 1960s who, she's famed for saying, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, but forms the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party with the sole intent to ensure that people who looked like her or came from communities like her had access to the vote and wasn't going to be denied because of their race or gender or socioeconomic status. So when you think about where citizenship rights and voting rights kind of advanced, they advanced literally during the same time period as when they were being highly restricted to many other groups in this country. But voter turnout matters. And if you just looked at that case study I was giving you of the Black vote in America, you can really kind of begin to see where the transformations happen. Black voters transformed this country. When African Americans show up 60% or more to vote, they turn elections every time. It's just the history of the United States. It's what the numbers show. They did so in the Reconstruction era between 1865 and 1880. It did so on the eve of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, where 72% of Black voter turnout in the North happened and 44% in the repressive Jim Crow South happened. It did so in the elections and re-elections of Barack Obama, where African-American turnout was 64.7% in his first election and 66.2% in his re-election. And it did so in the 2020 presidential election, where 63% of registered African-American voters voted. And so when you think about the way that people have been denied to vote, what does matter is when you vote in mass number, you can and have the ability to redirect your opportunities in society and life. But it doesn't mean that voter suppression isn't out there. As we convene right now, more than 400 anti-voter bills have been introduced in 48 states. And these bills are designed to erect unnecessary barriers for people to register to vote or to vote by mail or vote in person. They severely compromise democracy, our fundamental right to vote, and everyone's chance to be represented and heard. The methods include, but aren't limited to, strict voter ID laws, cuts to early voting, criminalizing mistakes at the ballot box, redistricting and gerrymandering, mass purge of voter rolls, and systemic disfranchisement. If you think about the criminalization of mistakes at the ballot box, here's Crystal Lavon Mason Hobbs, who made one mistake in the state of Texas when she went to vote, and she was sentenced to multiple years in jail for making that mistake. And it was an innocent mistake. And even the courts acknowledged it was an innocent mistake. But nonetheless, she was given the maximum penalty for that mistake. And so you see that there's this notion of this criminalization, this reality of criminalizing mistakes at the ballot box. But these aren't the only tactics. There are other examples. Another is denied voting rights because of a felony. So you could have got a felony in 1972, the year I was born, but depending on which state you're in, there is no recompense. Like you can never vote again. You have lost your right to have that fundamental right as a citizen in this country. As of 2020, 5.2 million Americans are denied the right to vote because of a felony conviction, and nearly 1.1 million of them, literally 1/5, reside in Florida, where the presidential elections of 2016 and 2020 were decided by fewer than 1.2 and 3.3%. Let's think about Al Gore, right? I think that was decided by less than 1,000 votes, if I'm not mistaken, in this regard. And then there were kind of the elections that we did our polls with, right? The off-year elections, where fewer than 20% turn out for these elections in the state of Illinois. So it's amazing to see that we had 92% in municipal elections, at least of the people that were polled for this conversation. But yet the numbers don't hold true that in municipal elections, think about the local school board in this sense, or you're voting for your county judge or district attorney. These are the things that are impacting you most in life, but yet we have the lowest turnout. So think about how many people across this nation are frustrated with certain catchphrases like critical race theory, or they're frustrated with the lack of responsiveness after George Floyd, or they're frustrated with the way people are handling COVID responses, things of the such, and how all of that it's a national issue, but it really is a local issue, because what they're doing nationwide doesn't impact you as much as it's happening on the ground at home. It's at this point that people aren't actually showing up to cast their votes to get the people in so the policies can be progressive in the direction it needs to go for the larger community. As Langston shared earlier in his opening remarks, they're not listening to the mouse, because they don't see their interests as being tied to the mouse or the greater community that they and the mouse reside within. And so you see these off-year elections that really have these lower turnouts, and you end up with politicians who would develop policies that may not be as progressive as individuals need for their respective communities. So the purpose of my presentation as I close here is that history shows that it has been unnecessarily difficult to vote in this country. In fact, the nation has spent more years restricting or suppressing the vote than ensuring all eligible citizens have a straightforward path to exercise their fundamental right to vote. And this is why it's so important for each one of us to not only vote, but to encourage others, to help others go register to vote and to vote in the days and elections ahead. As the kind of quote on the left side of the slide deck shows, you can either vote by voting or vote by not voting. If you don't vote, someone else's vote counts more. And that's just basic math. And so what we have to do is keep in mind is that Illinois so far has been pretty immune. We were the chicken, or we were the pig, or we were the cow in the opening fable that Langston shared with us. And for the past 2 decades, Illinois as a state has advanced voting rights far more than they have attempted to suppress them. But again, history shows this was not and may not always be the case. And today, citizens of Georgia and Texas, Florida, Mississippi, and Arizona, they face stark challenges to vote. They're the mouse, right? But tomorrow, it might be you, it might be me. And so we have to see ourselves as that collective community and think about the strategies, the important ways that we have to begin to rethink the way we think about what it means to vote in this country for the best interests of this country. And so with that, I'm going to close. I'm going to stop sharing here so I can kind of see folks, or at least hear folks. And I look forward to the questions that we have and the conversations that we'll have in the remaining time.
Thank you, Chris, for those, for your really, really insightful remarks. I think everyone here learned something new, so really appreciate you providing that historical context. Very important to know and understand how we got to where we are today. So there are a couple of questions and comments. The first is a comment. The first voter suppression was the Electoral College as the process for selecting the president. Not only did the South leverage its influence in Congress by 40%, which gave it control under the Civil War after Reconstruction, which gave it control until the Civil War. After Reconstruction, the voices of African Americans were suppressed because they were a minority in their southern states. So all of the electoral votes went to white candidates. If there was a popular vote for president, the votes of everyone would count. So thank you, Tricia, for providing that comment. One question, what about the laws in Florida that do not allow ex-felons to vote until they pay their fines and legal fees, subverting the ballot initiative? They wanted people's rights restored.
No, it's a great question. And again, you think about that 1.1 million, the in Florida dealing with those who have a felony and they can't vote. There is a clause in there. If they pay all the fines that are associated with it, they can have their vote back in that sense. But it's nearly impossible for them to kind of cover that cost in a reasonable amount of time, and most are discouraged because it's a compounded debt that's almost impossible to pay. And so the numbers still remain high in terms of people who can't vote in a state like that. Whereas in Illinois, Illinois will even allow you, even if you've been convicted of a felony, to still cast a vote, even if you're sitting in prison. And so people have debated that law and it's gone back and forth. And I want to be very clear, I am no expert on this subject matter, but I am familiar enough to give you some articulation to kind of think about how there is almost stolen citizenship here in this regard, as the way that we can think about these things. But to go to the point about the Electoral College, whoever made that comment, they're 100% correct. The Electoral College actually grew out of the 3/5 compromise. And so the idea that African Americans only represented 3/5 of a human being, when you're counting them for representation purposes in elections or census materials, things of such. And so as you're trying to tally what the Electoral College number would be in a state like Virginia, if you only counted the white population and discounted the 40% of the African American population at the time of the founding of moving to Virginia from colony to state, at the founding of this nation, then there would be no way that Virginia could ever have much sway or say in this sense. So they wanted to count 3/5. The compromise was counting 3/5 of every enslaved person or person of African descent in Virginia within that tally poll. And when they did that, Virginia actually had a higher Electoral College number than the state of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania had almost twice as many whites in its state than Virginia did. And Electoral College mattered very early on because literally 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States came from the state of Virginia. So how Virginia went, so went the election. And we hear that today now in states like Ohio or Florida in this sense. And so just think about the fact that there's literally 1/5 of all felons in this nation, who are unable to vote, that just reside in the state of Florida. And if given the same considerations as if they were in the state of Illinois, there could be a different presidential outcome in 2000, in 2016, et cetera. So.
Thank you for that. Clerk Ammon said it's a modern day poll tax. Absolutely. While we're on this topic of voter suppression relative to incarcerated individuals or formerly incarcerated individuals, Clerk Ammon says, no, you cannot vote from prison in Illinois. You can vote from the county jail, but not prison. There's a bill in the General Assembly now has not moved.
Well, this is why we got our experts in the room. Thank you, Clerk Ammons. And so I'm more 19th century than I am in that contemporary one. But I do appreciate that clarification, because you can see how I just deduced, even the term prison as to it having some universality, and there clearly are distinctions there. So I can't thank you enough for that clarification.
So our next question is the individual says, thank you so much for this presentation. If racial formation is part of the conversation of voter suppression, what is your take on voter suppression in predominantly Black nation states like Nigeria or Ghana, where Black people are citizens?
I'm sorry, could you read that question just one more time? I was having a little internet instability.
If racial formation is part of the conversation of voter suppression, what is your take on voter suppression in predominantly Black nation states like Nigeria or Ghana, where Black people are citizens?
I have no idea. I've never studied the specifics of those regions in that regard. So it's just beyond my area scope or expertise.
Maybe you could do some research and get back to that person who presented the question. Could you
I will do that. Yes, thank you.
Could you clarify the title of the infamous speech published in 1863, 12 years after the speech was actually delivered in 1851? Is it Aren't I a Woman or Ain't I a Woman?
I believe it. Well, honestly, I don't know the specifics. I'd have to look at it again, but I believe it's Aren't I a Woman? But I would have to go back and look at that.
Thank you. One question is, I'd appreciate knowing your thoughts on requiring voters to show IDs when they vote instead of providing signatures as we do in Illinois.
Quite honestly, I think the method in Illinois is working. We have a signature, it's on file. The person can show that signature upon entry into the vote, on the day that they're going to vote in this regard. If you think about the way the voter ID laws have been shaped in some states in this country, I think the challenge that people are facing is that not everyone has that ID in some states. And so a form of governmental ID sounds simple enough, like a driver's license. But if you think about college students, many of them may not have a driver's license in that sense. If they do have a driver's license, the address may not match the current residence because they have a college current residence in comparison to their permanent residence. For many elderly people, they're no longer driving. They may not have that ID in that sense. For individuals with disabilities, they may not be driving, so they won't have that ID in that sense. And so a signature is something everyone has, and it can be matched on the spot the day that you want to vote. Whereas an ID actually, as much as you think it isn't a barrier, I just kind of laid out three populations where it could be a real barrier because it's not as everyday happenstance as we think it to be.
Not to mention the financial cost of having an ID. You have to pay for it.
Yeah, and I have to actually go
That's a
get it
barrier.
and all of the things. So the logistics that would be tied to it.
Next question is, we're comforted by the pretty strong protection of voter rights here in Illinois, but would you comment on the importance of people pressing Congress to pass voting legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, very much. I think voting should have the least restrictions placed on it. That it should be one of the easiest things that we are able to do. And the most amazing thing in this past presidential election, and what we found out at least, is not only was it a secure election, it was one that people had the greatest access to be able to participate in. And we reconsidered the way we asked people to vote or gave them opportunities to vote because we were in the middle of a viral pandemic. And so having access to early voting, greater access to early voting, having access to mail-in voting or greater access to mail-in voting, extending the hours or even the locations to where you could vote. Many of the states across the nation did this, and to ensure that people could participate in this fundamental right. But then there were some who saw the outcomes and said, well, we're not satisfied with the outcomes and the results. And so you begin to see the shifts that have occurred and these series of bills that have come up. There's been nothing that has identified that there's been fraud or negligence in any meaningful way. And this, again, is not me as an expert speaking. It's me just kind of the observation and reading the data that we have on hand in this regard. But I do think that the greatest challenge that we face as this nation is, how do we allow everyday people just a right to vote without those restrictions? And it's something as a nation that we struggle with. So to come up with a John Lewis voting rights bill, that's a step in the right direction, but it won't. Voting in itself is still a matter of state. And so what happens in Florida is different than what's going to happen in Illinois in this moment. And so we have to have the same due diligence to ask our legislators to be mindful of the fact that we appreciate that everyone has access to the vote and can keep the vote. And there aren't restrictions to the vote, but greater access to the vote. And so we have to think about those dynamics and press our legislators to ensure that as they're considering the national bills, they're also protecting the state and the local ones as well. And everyday people can do that. Like it's not enough just for us to vote. That can't be our only civic responsibility. We have to be informed. We have to keep our elected officials held accountable, and we have to ask them to monitor and manage to the best of their ability greater accesses and affordances for everyday people to exercise this fundamental right. That the goal should be to protect, not to restrict.
Absolutely. And one audience member said, going back to the voter ID laws, as people age, their signatures may change. And I absolutely have experienced that, not necessarily due to age, but I became a registered voter at the age of 18. 10, 15 years later, when I changed my name to add my husband's name, my signature changed. To be able to very easily just update my signature was something that I really appreciated, Just a couple more questions. You mentioned in your presentation both the struggle for differing groups to get the vote, but more specifically, the struggle for African Americans to keep the vote from being suppressed. Why did you take this approach?
No, I appreciate the question. And I think the one thing I wanted to show is that when we hear about voter suppression today, or even in the past, the first profile or demographic that comes to mind are African Americans. And disproportionately, that story is true. How African Americans have either fought for the vote and then fought to keep the vote is the story of the challenges of voting in the United States. But it's not the only one. And I think what I wanted to do in this presentation was remind people that we are part of a collective whole in a community, and that just because you might gain access to something doesn't mean that it was universally accessed by everyone in this sense. Or just because you're fighting, may not be the only one fighting for it. And so it's just that you're kind of out on the forefront. Many people are beneficiaries of the efforts of African Americans who started the civil rights movement and really, paid the ultimate price with their lives in the civil rights movement. But the historian in me would also point to, well, look at the number of mass movements that occurred in the 1970s, right? You had what they call the Red Power movement of Native Americans. You had the Black Power movement of African Americans. You had the women's rights movement in the 1970s, which almost led to the Equal Rights Amendment, right? And it's still on the table. We're still fighting to have the Equal Rights Amendment, but it definitely led to the National Organization of Women being more pronounced and equalization of women in higher education, at least greater access in higher education. All of that postdates the civil rights movement when we put the parameters up, right? Of say 1955 to 1968. But when you get to 1970 to 1980, these are all the outgrowth of that. That's part of where we see the same thing in voting rights. So this is not a struggle of one group over another group. We've always talked about America in a racial binary in these moments, whites and blacks. But what we need to understand is we've always been a multicultural nation. We've always been a nation of diversity, striving to have equal rights and considerations under the law. And in this short moment, I really wanted to show that long struggle of that diversity, but also knowing I had a limited amount of time to highlight a bit of a case study of African Americans and the challenges they faced with voter suppression.
Thank you for that response. Final question before we go to our final poll. Beyond voting, what can people do to try to change or eliminate voter suppression tactics?
That's a question for me, or that's a poll?
It is, that's a question for you, yes.
Okay, because I thought you were saying it was a final poll.
The
But
last
again,
question.
I think we just have to be we have to be diligent. We have to know who our elected officials are, hold them accountable, know the kinds of things that we want in our community, know that people should have equal protections under the law. Like, again, you may look at someone across the aisle and say, I don't agree with their politics, and I don't really like what they have to say. But what I would hope is the last thing you would say is, I don't want them to vote, because they have every right to vote no different than you. And if the shoe was on the other foot, you wouldn't want them to have that kind of power or control over you. The goal is we can have civil disagreements, but the ultimate say is democracy in America, and the ultimate tool for democracy in America is voting. So in order to have the vote and to preserve the vote, you have to be educated as to what the issues are. And you have to make sure that the people that you have placed in power are held accountable to that. The other thing is we have to educate our youth to understand that getting involved, being civically engaged, having a sense of responsibility, taking ownership in your own community, all of these things are very active general practices that when it is time for them to vote, their voting just becomes an extension of the kind of civil engagement and community they want to build. You have to have a vision as to where you want to be. And if I had to ask people, if you want to get rid of COVID, what would be your strategies to get rid of COVID, right? We need to have the same strategies if your vote is being suppressed. If you want to get rid of that, what will be your strategies to get rid of that so you can have the outcomes that you need? And then who are your allies, your resources, your politicians, your policymakers who can make those things happen and keep them engaged?
Very good. Thank you, Chris, for your wonderful remarks this evening. As I mentioned before, very educational, very insightful. I'm sure that I am not alone in saying that if you were not encouraged before this presentation to make sure that your vote counts and your voice matters, I'm sure that the attendees on tonight's webinar will certainly make their voice count in future elections. So thank you again for your remarks. Yes, did you have one last?
No, I was going to say, and if you don't think your vote has power, then just keep this in mind. No one would try to take something away from you unless it was powerful. Right. And so your vote has power. And like I said, if you show up, just in the African-American case, if you show up in 60%, you determine the future of what's going to happen. So make sure that you go out and you do your part.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. So thanks again, Chris, for joining us as our keynote this evening. We have one last poll question that we'll put up now. The question is, how can you help retain voting rights in Illinois? A, be aware of potential legislative changes to the election code. B, discuss any concerns with your state legislators. C, be active and voice your opinions and reasons. D, register to vote and vote. Or E, all of the above. All right, and as expected, 100% of our attendees who participated in the poll said E, all of the above. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your attendance and your interest in this subject matter. We have a tremendous responsibility to make sure that we're not only registering our members of our community to vote, but we're helping individuals become more educated about voting and their voice and that tremendous responsibility. I want to take just a couple seconds to preview our upcoming webinars on April 20th at 6:30. We have Educate Yourself About Community Concerns with Tracy Parsons of Champaign and Lamont Peppers of Urbana. They will address strategies in Champaign-Urbana designed to address gun violence in our communities. On June 15th at 6:30, we have Holding Our Elected Officials Accountable. City Council members from Champaign and Urbana will be invited to share their vision and goals with the constituents they serve and what they have done thus far to accomplish their goals. So you can always go to our chapter website to find more information about our upcoming webinars and any information about the chapter and our connections activities. Just go to the drop-down menu under programs and then click on connections and you will find that information. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Spann, for being here with us this evening. Very, very, very important and informational material. Thank you so much.